Hello everyone, today we talk about the market differences within the various Italian maritime republics. We narrow it down to the main three, so Venice, Genoa and Pisa. I made multiple videos already about the Italian maritime republics, about international commerce, also about the maritime republics. As such, this is definitely an important topic because, as we've seen prior, these republics alone were essentially monopolizing the intercontinental trade, right? Especially between Europe and the Mediterranean, and most of what was in fact the one with the East, that was also the most important in the properly political and institutional development of the elites, the establishment, and it's the background really of the development of much of, in fact, pre-modern mathematics, accounting, banking, and really more, because the actually interesting part of this is the actual political history of all the various cities, which, as you know, we cover in our historical region series, that often get overshadowed by this sort of very liberally oriented kind of topic, like the international commerce. Look at how the cities traded with so many different cultures and places. And we tend to forget, first of all, that even though of course these ports were in fact the also obliged point of passage of, at least because these powers had sort of aggressively monopolized control the major maritime routes, of resources that, however, were to pass also in different hands, and that these weren't alone, in fact, the single richest or more powerful polities in just central northern Italy that at this point have this level of communal homogeneity. And that, in fact, gets often forgotten as far as the sort of mercantilistic bias that we have toward these republics, meaning that the actual, demographic, economical power behind the political territorial control, these regions laid often beyond these powers. Actually, we have seen how, like, Venice and Genoa fundamentally did not have a real interland, like, territorial interest. They controlled ports around, sometimes like larger, islands, that you can consider as land masses, but that weren't actually that developed in that specific function, and that properly avoided that direct land commitment. Pisa was the only city of the canonic maritime republics to have a substantial interland, which they also expanded dramatically. Right, by the 13th century, actually, Pisa had the most tactically effective army in entire communal Italy, and these aspects are sort of underrated, especially when one considers too much socio-economical stuff and not, for example, the excellent political or institutional development of the Tuscan maritime republic. That is also not all, right? You must understand actual warfare and sources beyond the normative, the dispositive, because you have to understand what concretely happened in the councils, on the battlefield, etc. I made a series, by the way, about both, multiple series about Genoa and Pisa. We still haven't made Venice. I'm actually starting, if you have noticed, the Florentine history, because Florence was actually the strongest power in Tuscany, even if it didn't have a port, and even if it was the literally richest city in the entire globe, right, and controlled a large part of European finance, and there was all, at this point, especially a wealth Angevin axis that, as you know, allowed the Tuscan wealth at least to, in fact, access, especially the Sicilian grain, much of some of the most important resources had been subcontracted in the southern kingdom to, in fact, these Tuscan bankers since the crusade of Charles of Anjou against Manfred. So there is all a say interland background that I care very much about, and that's I started actually that series for. And before starting to talk about this market, trade, commercial issues, I would like also to spend a word for Milan, because I must say some of you come up with, have you ever played that medieval Total War mod about this? What do you think about? I used to be a modder. I used to do a lot of that stuff, but quite a long time ago now. I definitely don't have the time for it, and really I had minimally, even in the times in which I was seriously active. And the point is that, as you know, I'm very attentive to sort of this pop cultural vibe that I think YouTube in many ways still indicates in a fairly objective way in the reflection of, let's say, more mass culturally or subculturally relevant part of the population. And there is a huge disappointment, and I think especially a huge gap when you come to consider the Italian communes, right? For example, the same fact here covering the maritime republic is something that very often gets done just excluding basically any other Italian political, military, and social topic. I can easily be the only person still, because over time certain gaps were filled in terms of subjects, etc., that actually ever talked, and at least also to a substantial degree, of the Italian political institutional development, the actual communes, what these systems were. They're military as well, because that's also what they specialize in, and then of course all these other social aspects. The impression, as I was saying before, is always the mercantilistic bias. This primarily centers focused on commerce. There's also the medieval Total War II meme about Venice that sort of distracts you in some ways. At least video games, paradoxically, have been useful also to raise actual awareness about different polities, the diversity, for example, of communal Italy. There are lots of mods, especially for, as you know, I don't have to tell you, for say titles like Attila, still that people play and discovering these communes. But when it actually comes to define what they were doing, like what we're actually about, and also in comparison to other powers, it becomes sort of foggy. People don't know, don't read. This is admittedly a bit the fault, especially from a military point of view, of the same Italian historiography. They have actually, well, considering the average layman's awareness, like actually a lot about their medieval and even more specifically communal warfare, but it's still a non-popularized topic. Actually, I could easily exploit this gap at this point, and in part I've already done it, but I think that going step by step, so not avoiding sort of the most hit topics at a point, can be an important strategy, because maybe through the maritime republics, one can make you understand what the fact that there were, some more complex and less stereotypical systems than this sort of fact reductivistic idea of just cities with merchants, like was fundamentally about. But it's also about considering the actual wealth passing through Italian hands as a very important, let's say, dynamic factor in some of the most important, or the most important political and military events taking place at this point. Today we talked mostly about the 13th century, so this is the peak of medieval civilization in many ways. Talk briefly also about the early 14th, because that's probably the peak, and that's the peak also of the communal civilization. In Italy, have some videos incoming about Italian armies of the time, also some specials connected with the series about Florence. Today, however, we tend to characterize mostly like the different trade policies, commercial policies that that the three major maritime republics had. Mostly, as we'll see, and famously enough, in relation with one another. At this point, like the 13th century, is the moment of greater, say, peak of their, of their collective power. You can say also in relative terms to other powers who were rising at the time. But of course, there are some ups and downs. Like, for example, the Pisans are crushed by the Genoese at the Battle of Meloria, and after that, actually, they start investing in the Genoese markets anyway, and Pisa is still actually a power to be reckoned with, also, as we've seen also on the terra firma, and it doesn't simply die out, right? That actually happens, like together with, say, at least in a political sense, it would remain important cities also by early modern standards, and also economically, right? But in terms of actual autonomy, actual political liberty, that's another story. And at least in this case, we're talking about Florentine expansionism. Then Venice and Genoa will battle against one another. As you know, Genoa almost manages to knock out Venice at the end of the 14th century with the War of Chioggia. But what is mostly important here is that actually Venice is a much better state, right, and a much sort of more stable system than Genoa is. Genoa is very privatized, very sort of clan-based. Venice is an oligarchic system, but has managed to lock successfully the Senate, the entire very complicated political system. However, was also very functional for the stability of the state. That's also how they recover quite quickly from their defeats. But what is actually impressive, and that's especially evident in the 14th century, is the immense amount of resources that especially Venice and Genoa invest in war. This is true actually for Italy as well. If you look at the, say, nonsensically underrated, but especially totally ignored as massive and also literally macroscopical intensity of warfare in terms of armies, numbers, size, tactical development. This is literally the peak of medieval warfare in especially second half of 13th century, early 14th century Italy. You realize the immensity, especially considering this was not, as you know, a realm, at least in theory. Like, yes, there was a kingdom of Italy, but it was hardly ever ruled by any individual figure feudally, and it was the city-states that factually were, especially in the first half of the 14th century, compact in some regional dominions. Like the immensity of also the resources spent for this commercial wars, and fundamentally also think if, I don't know, this of course doesn't make sense because in part the reason why this maritime republics were so florid was that they were ports, right? Geography. But if not all of it, as you know, also because many cities that were well placed, let's say, especially in the south, like the original maritime republic, the most important ones were actually emerging from Byzantine, post-Byzantine Italy in the south, where we made a video about Amalfi. And so, again, also in this sense, geopolitics does not exist. But imagine if, like, those immense resources, the immense fleets, right, had been invested for, I don't know, project of national monarchy or political recompaction of central northern Italy. That was in many ways being accomplished. That was what I was saying before. If you look at Milan, that we made multiple videos on, you realize that it got pretty close, right? And at least hegemonizing the entirety of northern and even central Italy towards the mid 14th century. And what I was actually digressing on, I was appalled, is how, again, people tangentially know about the Italian maritime republics. Why? Because, I don't know, of video games, because you can give them settlements overseas, and it's kind of cool. But there is literally like an entire chunk that sort of ignores, for example, the actual say, power policy and territorial extension of dominions like the Milanese one. So just make an example, people want to see this, I don't know, Genoa as a faction in these games, but they totally ignored that Milan was way more powerful. At least they don't want to quantify this in a sort of technically political, military, and social sense. So the idea perhaps that these were city-states, it's sort of difficult to digest in realizing at least that these were actual regional powers with armies of 30,000 men, so the same ones of entire kingdoms, and that this completely gets skipped, sort of glissed over for some reason, and that we still have to sort out. I'm always shocked when I open the Oxford Encyclopedia of Medieval Warfare, and of all the sort of minutiae that they inserted, they literally do not talk about the 1315 Battle of Montecatini. I mean, there are so many different, for example, Italian battles of the same period that for some specific historiographical reasons they sort of came to be more or less known. And the Anglosphere, say Campaldino or Montaperti, etc. Montecatini, simply for the fact it was not particularly publicized, etc., it was a massive battle, 30 versus 30,000 men, right? We're talking about 60,000 actual fighters in total on the battlefield, for real, right? By all accounts, the large, like the 30, 40 accounts that we have on the battle, also with the single most advanced historiography of the time, where if you compare the Italian chronicles of the early 14th century to, say, I don't know, the contemporary ones of Flanders, it seems like there is a 100-year civilizational gap in between. It's the high level of Italian civilization is, at this point in history, is utterly insane. Is something shocking, and that's also why I made some videos about the Italian domination of the Mediterranean, the banking monopoly, also in the later Middle Ages, even after the big crisis and also the big banking cracks of the 1330s, the 1340s, that are also very interesting topics that we have to cover at some point, have a lot to do with England, France as well, the 100 Years' War, Naples, like those are relevant topics. But let's pass finally to the actual topic of today. For anyone needing some introduction, again, there is a medieval economy, medieval trade playlist that you can check out. There is the Italian communes playlist. Whatever the curiosity, or you want a video on a specific topic, just signal it to me. It doesn't mean that I will do it only because you ask me, but we want to cover everything, so you could give me some idea, right? Now, as we were saying, the 13th century essentially marks the culmination of this commercial expansion initiated by the Italians, and that, however, had basically encompassed, obviously, through their trade connections, the entirety of Europe, and especially the West as the leading powerhouse of everything, basically, not just wealth. This was just, as we were saying, a reflection of the level of development of European civilization by that point, that had basically broken most of the other competitors around, and or sort of westernized them in many ways, even in the Islamic world. And this expansion had enabled the Italians to dominate Mediterranean trade first and foremost, and consequently, in fact, the same significant portion of European commerce. To accurately contextualize this outcome, it is essential to consider some topics. So, first of all, which were the mercantile networks that had been established, straddling the three continents bordering the Mediterranean, and also what products were traded within these networks, right? So, in other words, what are the underlying trends in this European commercial development, in fact, shaped by the Italian controlled international trade. So regarding to the first point, it's essential to note the distinct, say, commercial inclinations of the three main Italian naval powers. Right? There were other republics up to this day. We talked about even Ragusa / Dubrovnik. We talked about, say, many of the southern Italian ports were actually what had been taken over by the same powers. And it was, of course, Sicilian and also after the Vespers, like also Neapolitan power. Depends. It was already in Angevin times and Neapolitan sort of continental based power even over to Sicily. But let's say there are some these republics are not acting in a vacuum, right? And especially as far as Western Europe is concerned, because really at sea they do not have rivals but themselves, and they were for this reason backed by this power or the other. At this time, the 13th century witnesses the rise of the Catalonian trade as well, that will become very important for basing, as you know, the same Aragonese conquest of Sicily and later Naples and Sardinia. But fundamentally, right, aside from, again, other, also in autonomous powers, there is Ancona, there are, other senses. You have essentially Venice, Genoa, and Pisa in the radar as of the main, trade powers at this point. So, according to ancient trade practices dating back to 1279, Pisan merchants start from Pisa, the smallest one, the smaller power. Merchants acquired spices in Alexandria of Egypt, Acre, Lazica, as well as Levantine textile products. The Pisans, the Genoese, had been quite early on in the Levant, right? They had allowed logistically the same crusades to happen. They had participated themselves as crusaders. You know how relevant the same capture of Jerusalem had been thanks to the military contribution. So what I like always to say is that the Italians were in the Levant before the Crusade, and when the Crusades ended, they still were there, and they would remain there, right, for that time. So it was their place, controlling the ports. That's mostly what they did, but obliging, in this sense, the local powers to essentially let them operate, because going at war with them was feasible on land, but then you would have remained cut off from international trade, and that would have eventually just needed the Italians to come back. We've seen how many backs and forths, like the Venetians and the Byzantines, were involved in. At this point, say, different powers would kick this specific mercantile group from that port, and then however they reinstated them, depending on the. In fact, and that's the funniest part of the Middle Ages, that this sort of more structuralistic, systemic, and sort of approximate and conventional lessons tend to exclude, like the incredibly complicated, incredible variation in politics due to power fragmentation in part, but the actual strength of the individual groups involved in the scale of power, the same. Then the Pisans exported the aforementioned goods, so as we've seen, spices and textiles, fundamentally to the same Pisa, Montpellier, Marseille, the Champagne fairs, Naples, Messina, and North Africa. These were all key markets in many ways. Southern France, Occitania, had always been sort of autonomous, sort of competitive. At this point, they're brought under the Capetans for good, but they had some level of even an entrepreneurship that eventually was taken over essentially by the Italians. Predictably enough, like essentially the local ports had sided either for Genoa or Pisa, and then eventually, like, they had been themselves tied to the Italian markets. The same goes for the Champagne fairs, that, as you know, was the most important trade hub in continental Europe. there is all the connection: English wool, Flemish textiles, Champagne fairs, redistribution to agricultural products, then the Rhone Valley to Provence, and from there to Tuscany. And so, broadly speaking, the Ligurian, the Tyrrhenian trade controlled by these republics. And naturally much longer arranged, connections. Like at this point, during the Pax Mongolica, it's plenty of Europeans and especially of Italians in China, notoriously. And there is really an insane level of commercial expansion. We'll see now, like what kind of markets were also touched further. And in turn, then you have, of course, southern Italy, Naples, Messina. Obviously, Naples was essentially the capital of the Sicilian kingdom at this point. Messina is the Sicilian Strait, and even after Sicily is lost to the Aragonese, basically, yes, you have Palermo that has remained for the most important center in Sicily, and more or less however the portual situation with this sort of siding of different at times Genoa is Guelph, Pisa is Ghibelline, right? They are all invested in this enormous international struggle, with the most important monarchies in Europe at the time, Germany, Sicily, France, and so on. And North Africa is just important because of all the, say, ivory, slaves, gold from Black Africa, etc. And so the Italians control not just the North African ports, but they circumnavigate northwestern Africa and they arrive up to Black Africa themselves. They have outposts there and they control much of that trade as well. So it's actually telling you like how, and this is true for all these involved, because here we will sort of distinguish the various theaters, but they were actually present pretty much everywhere because there were different groups that were more or less competitive within the same cities. And so, of course, you could find Italians from all these cities and others, by the way, because there were lots of other cities that participated into this, also the land ones, sending merchants that were just privately taking on taking up this initiative, and just even fueling the trade of the hegemonic polity that had established colonies there. And so from North Africa, the peasants exported wool, leather, skins, other goods which were reciprocated with spices, Flemish and French woolen cloth, typically, also Italian linen cloth, and agricultural products from southern Italy. The Italian wool cities, there was a florid textile production in Italy. At some point it will surpass even in quality the Flemish one. Actually, some Flemish weavers will relocate, will immigrate properly into some of this Italian communes and make a living there under these Italian companies. So the Champagne fairs, Levantine markets, and other commercial centers were all involved into this. Were absorbed, were subsumed in this enormous circuit that was witnessing, as you know, the Italians founding veritable colonies, like entire quarters, not just in ports, but say buying houses in London or in Paris, right, and then becoming incredibly important even for providing, again, those loans to the local monarchies, contracting military recruitment. This was especially the case with France. Think about how important the Genoese were, both on land and sea, in the French armies of the 100 Years' War. Just to give that example, the same happened for the Iberian monarchies, like the Castilian fleet in Seville were fundamentally Genoese, like admirals, sailors, ships, they were all practically Italian. That's also how the age of exploration actually starts from these maritime powers with the Iberian launching pad and investment. There is, let's say, an importance of southern Italy in this that is often underrated. Sicily, especially when it was like an entire kingdom, was literally immense, was one of the most powerful ones in Europe. Also, it had historically been well administered, at least until the 13th century, when, say, in the late Swabian and also the Angevin and the Aragonese eras, like things started going downhill. Naples was an enormous system. The southern Italian mainland was very complicated to rule. There was a lot of, as you know, baronial power essentially negotiating with the monarchic one. And in this sense, a lot of gangles, a lot of sort of different opportunities. Think about Roger de Flor, that literally emerges from these piracy trade, like mercenarism, during the wars between Angevin Naples and Aragonese Sicily. So there was a lot of activity there of the Italian navies that were essentially the only true stable ones that existed, because they didn't have something like a permanent navy, let's say, just ruled by the state, but the state was the various nobiliar houses that had always at sea a certain amount of galleys, and so in time of war they would just put these in common. And these republics had virtually like not just permanent forces, but also professional ones, just to control the entire maritime space. Right, at the time, you couldn't quite control the entire sea. That's something that wouldn't be possible until the Victorian era, technologically. So there were other, in fact, also pirates, other, sort of other powers being into this. But overall, all right, this was a primate that wasn't really challenged by anyone. And the commercial circuit originating from southern Italy, mostly because of the agricultural resources of this place, that had began to export even to places like that historically, like in antiquity, had been the granaries of the empire. Africa for Rome, Egypt for, I'm talking Roman Africa, of course, Egypt for Constantinople. Like at this point, is that Sicily exports grain to these places. That's a complete change. It's a radical alteration of the trade balance that had already occurred, but is keeping to flourish, especially in the 13th century. Southern Italy, in turn, received spices, rich oriental products, and finished goods from central Italy and Europe as a whole. The connections being very important because Sicily was a feudal state, right? The Angevins, the Aragonese, having their own courts, having their own, as we've seen, powerful barons, and so this luxury goods essentially were quite sought after. In turn, southern Italy exported food products and raw materials also to the rest of Italy, the Levant and Africa, as we were saying. This is essentially what Pisa was involved in. And in contrast to the Tuscan Maritime Republic, a relatively simple exchange of spices and Flemish woolen clothes with the Champagne fairs, Venice's commercial circuits were characterized instead by a different spatial layout. Right, Venice had always been more than Genoa and Pisa about to the east, at least properly the prevalent power there, and in many ways also for geographical reasons. Venice controlled the Adriatic, the straits between Apulia and Pyrrhus, and so it was just better suited for historically, politically, culturally, for intervening in the eastern markets. Venice had technically emerged from within the Byzantine Empire, as you know, and for this reason had historically received many privileges. We talked about Alexius Comnenus recently in different videos, where the Venetians, in fact, were that prominent. At this point, Venice had actually taken over the Byzantine Empire together with the Crusaders. As you know, in 1204, following the Fourth Crusaders, acquiring numerous bases in Romania that further facilitated their navigation and trade. right? The Venetians had the right of conquest of, say, much larger part, and probably of the Byzantine hinterland, but as we said, they couldn't give a freaking damn about the hinterland. They led it to the Crusaders, said, that's your mess. You have to administer it in a completely different way. You have a territory, you have a population, you must organize and administer it. We can't care less. We want ports, only ports, and maintaining our trade going and becoming richer in the process. Venice, as you know, also because of St. Mark's relics connected with, of course, the translation, actually the transfiguration of the saint from Egypt was very connected with the Alexandrian markets. Venice and Egypt, like since antiquity, you can argue, at least for those settlements that existed in the Venetian lagoons already at the time, had always had that preferential eastern connection, and a much wider range one in this sense, as far as especially the Aegean traffics were concerned. Venetians had this, especially during the 13th century now, bases in Romagna that facilitated all this navigation and trade, that the Genoese had come to, as you know, contrast, because they were instead supporting the Palaiologoi, the Empire of Nicaea, in fact recovering from the Crusaders and the Venetians what had sort of been lost. And the Genoese had been subcontracted, as you know, lots of say settlements. Think about Lesbos, Chios. That there are lots of different that provided, for example, with a very sought after alum, like these various islands that the Byzantines factually wouldn't be able even to get back, because it's not that they liked the Italians, the Latins in general, at all, but they, and the say the sentiment was reciprocal. But of course, this is politics, and of course the Genoese were not to simply hand back, over the islands, nor actually make sense for the Byzantine Empire, even after Constantinople is recovered, to weaken the Genoese in the face of the Venetian hegemony in the situation. Moreover, the Venetians controlled prominent positions themselves in the ports of Syria and Palestine, as well as in Alexandria, they were saying Egypt, and North Africa. Right? We tend to think North Africa, especially the central western part, to be mostly like a Pisan, Genoese business. Actually, there were Venetians, as we were saying before. They all found each other there, and often they sort of battled against one another, destroying the entire portual cities in the process. And again, the local authorities could do really little, because especially if you don't have a fleet on your own, and especially at least the Italian ones are better anyway, you can't besiege the Italian quarters just right on the sea, when they can be resupplied by their own navies, right? And that's how toxic this relationship really is. I would say the Italians were pretty, assertive and sort of like impositive, to say the least. But the level of dynamism, of entrepreneurship, and sheer raw, brutal, violent, traumatic aggression that Venice displayed was really unmatched. Like the Venetians had a crystal clear vision of what their power had to be, and they were again the most politically successful in pursuing that, for sure. The mercantile circuits established by the merchants of the Serenissima were multifaceted and comprised various regions. Trade in the Adriatic, in the Aegean, the Black Sea, that in Italian was known as Mare Maggiore, which means the greater sea, at least of these closed ones that you understand that we're considering as all different sort of systems on their own. And needless to say, the straits that connected them being also the theater of some of the fiercest clashes, because again, you couldn't quite intercept a fleet, as we were saying before, with that scientific certainty. But considering all the various currents in the Mediterranean that are sort of cyclical, they happen, with that general, likelihood at the different during the year, you can sort of ambush some convoys, right, that are also pretty sizable. And so mostly the fleets that are developed by the Italians to fight against one another, also because there's nobody else out there can challenge them, revolve around these escorts, right? And there were massive engagement. Again, we'll get to the video in which we'll see the actual expenses. It's something like unbelievable. Like we're talking here, in interest of time, in single wars in the millions of florins. There were cities that were sold for some tens of thousands of florins, right? And within the same Italy, some of the largest ones in Europe. So this gives you an idea of the scale of wealth also it was available for this kind of trade that, however, paradoxically was reinvested, as we've seen financially, also in many other ways, but was kept sort of conservatively by the Italians. At least the way they invested was very clever, was not like about treasuring them, but let's say these were powers who had literally greater wealth than major European realms, and yet they used it just to strengthen their own city position, right? At some point also expanding regionally, but always within Italy and not really being interested in much more. That's also in part why the Italian wars, the political crisis of Italy sort of broke out, because these cities had all a very sort of municipal, so-called campanalistic sense of themselves. It's not that they lacked the means, but they lacked the vision or the necessity or the interest to be like a greater power summed up. Indeed, had, for example, Venice or Genoa not been at war with one another, the same Italian wars would have never been fought, because nobody could have invaded Italy without a maritime coverage, maritime support. That's just a little aspect of it all. So when you look at this, so in Venice, of course, traded with North Africa, as we've seen, and all those that link each area to others, right? These circuits also entailed north-south connections, some of which are very underrated, especially the Venetian ones with Central Europe. But remaining at sea, as we've seen, commerce was organized through convoys of ships bound for Romania, the Black Sea, and overseas destinations such as Syria and Egypt, ultimately converging, of course, on the market of Rialto, that is Venice, the island which Venice was born. And this market, of course, was also the largest Venetian market, as it is where Levantine products find demand, and those who be re-exported to the Levant are sourced as well. So it's a massive square. This is the reason why the connection with Central Europe begins, because Germans arrived in Venice to exchange, especially their silver, right, from their mines, and other non-ferrous metals for Indian and Mediterranean products. This is incredibly interesting. Like, people are also obsessed about, look, there's a Buddha in Viking era somewhere in Scandinavia. Oh my God, such far-range context. Oh my God, how interesting, how provocative. Then there's massive intercontinental trade going on, right, from Europe to China throughout all this time. Massive amount of material, evidence of items. That's not as interesting. This is Europe. Like, this is the system in itself. Like, at this point, 1/4 of Europeans were Italian, just by proportion, and here they were also the richest by far of other Europeans. So it's insane if you understand how big this system actually was at a civilizational level. Now, every product that arrived in Venice had, of course, its customer base already. Since the 13th century, the Lombards, properly the ones from Lombardy, were primary buyers of cotton, which arrived in large quantities annually on the port docks from Syria, right? It's again with those convoys that had a specific timing. They were so big that they just were one at a time during the year. That's why enormous battles were triggered to contend and to inflict economic pain to the enemies, because again there were all these customers that waited for those goods, and Venice maintained direct relations with the rest of Europe, mainly through this the famous fondaco of the Germans. Fondaco is the Italian. Some commercial terms arrived in the European vocabularies through the time of the Islamic Golden Age, where trade was in the hands of the Muslims. From funduk, that means warehouse, right? Also admiral. There are lots of words that still used from Arab, and this was in fact the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, that is to say, the German warehouse, the warehouse of the Germans, that, as you know, is also very famous, like historical building, touristic attraction in Venice today. And it was the German warehouse that organized for its benefit, this, in fact, Venetian or German partnership that would expand, particularly during the 14th century, for different reasons, including the fact that at least the Venetians found their way, instead of trying to circumnavigate Italy, that, as we've seen, was unsafe because of the Genoese, all the other powers along the coast, and also the rise of the Catalans in the west. That Venice had allied herself with an anti-Genoese faction that literally shifted trade routes, also making the Rhone Valley less relevant, because southern France was engulfed by the English chevauchée at that point. France was in crisis in general, so the Saint Genoese are battered by the Venetian-Catalan alliance. They actually circumnavigate the Iberian Peninsula. They open much greater Atlantic routes to reach Flanders in England. And so basically this routes go away from France, that also suffers importantly of this, and Venice, from her side, chooses the continental path, right? It's important to notice that Venice has not really developed like a coherent, say, a solid terra firma dominion that would happen mostly in the 15th century to counter Milan territorially in the hinterland of northern Italy. But has herself in the 30s stepped into properly the mainland, because she had already done it from the previous century, etc. The Venetians were, say, infesting a bit all the various places that they could invade from the coast. The siege of Ferrara, they had also been excommunicated by the Pope. There will be interesting military histories that I think are much more interesting, in fact, in this videos, but we need these two. And the sense was, in that case, protecting the salt mines that had been threatened by the Della Scala dynasty. I've made a video about Verona that talks about the war. And after that war, they sort of don't get away from the influence they have started exerting on communes that had once been under Verona and that now were influenced by Venice. There is also all of politics now, a relation with the south, in fact with German powers proper, the contrast between the Bavarians, the Habsburgs, and the same northeastern Italy. And that's, again, a very, very fascinating chapter we don't have, unfortunately, the time to descend in. Still at sea, like, what is important here is that the first galleys of Venice that ventured into the North Sea, to make you understand how relatively uninterested Venice had been in, say, Western market, did not set sail until 1317, right? And their voyages were not always regular at all, right? Also because the Genoese were much more there, much better sort of placed. They were interrupted for these voyages were interrupted for 20 years. After which they resumed on an annual basis. in 1384, which, however, establishes like some continuous connections indeed. Now, passing to Genoa, following the year 1261, the Ligurian Republic achieves dominance in Romania, right? Because the Byzantines have recovered Constantinople. And in particular, like, the Venetians are not really dislodged, all right? So they remain in a sort of balanced position. The Venetians have a greater advantage, but they're sort of balanced odds. What the Genoese mostly get is the Black Sea colonies, right? Those would be, as you know, maintained until literally the Ottoman conquests in the 15th century. The consolidation of Mongol dominance had enabled the Genoese to reach the pinnacle of Italian trade by this point, spanning from China to the Atlantic and the North Sea by 1277. Talking about Kaffa, Tanais, these were the colonies. There were many. If we look at the castle of Sudak in Crimea, there were massive fortifications in the Black Sea and the Azov Sea. This favored, like, properly this last decades of the 13th century, a booming moment for Genoa. The commerce of the Genoese did not differ significantly from that of other Italian cities. Right? There wasn't a major difference in the essence of these activities. And again, they had lots of other stuff going on. It wasn't just trade, right? In this people's affairs, there was primarily politics, war, looking at what was happening in the hinterland, trying to influence all these processes. You hardly ever hear of them because nobody gets the patience of getting into the actual specifics. And you know what? I will start another branch of the cycle about 14th and 15th century Italian powers, because it's too important. Like, we haven't basically ever covered it, and we really need much of this. The Genoese traded substantial quantities of silk as far as from Kaifeng, that is China. It's in the Henan province, just to give you an idea here of the ranges, and the Caspian region, right? Because they started literally from the Silk Route in Ukraine, right? And this is as relevant as it got. You had alum and mastic, and that's controlled by the Ligurians as well. And additionally, Genoa traded wheat, wax, leather, furs, Turkish cotton, and slaves. In return, Genoa imported into Romania woolen cloth, linen cloth, metal products, wine, oil, and other food products, as well as silver, to settle the trade deficit that was definitely high. Now, the Genoese also had a significant presence in North Africa, as we remembered, with a favorable trade balance, allowing them here to export gold from Sudan especially. And this will enable them to reintroduce gold coinage in the West. Like, it's literally about the Genoese. There's also a specific coin that is known as the Genuine, in fact, minted starting from 1252. This was a great deal. Still at this point, like, the struggle, right, for over Italy between the Germanic emperors and the say the Guelph forces supported by different powers, manifested through the public concession by the emperors, in fact, of minting rights to this or that faithful community. Kind of made we talk about this sort of alternation of internal regime changes. It's too long of a story to cover for the single cities, but again, I made a video about Genoa, a couple about Pisa, so that those should cover that in decent detail. Consider that there was the simultaneous minting of the florin in Florence that would become, as we've seen, that relevant because of the Florentine primate in financial power. There are interesting sets of evidence, like documents, especially drafted by notaries, such as the Genoese Pietro Battifoglia in Tunis. We are 1288, 1289, highlighting, in this case, the primary role of southern Italian products, wheat, oil, wine, on this African market, with only limited quantities of wool, leather, balls of cloth, and lambkins being traded from Burgundy. All right. That area was not definitely going down at this point, but still didn't have the capacity to simply overcome the Italian production as a whole. So the trade balance between Europe and the Levant was at this point unfavorable to the latter. It had shifted essentially since the end of the so-called Islamic Golden Age. So if you look at the 11th century, fundamentally, that's where the Pisans and the Genoese had literally made that happen, right, quite violently as well. And the balance had maintained itself ever since Europe exported more woolen clothes than it received spices, for example. That's why the German-Venetian connection was so important, because for Venice, metals from Central Europe were even more crucial for her oriental trade than the Flemish woolen cloth was for Genoa. Right, most of the resources access was across the Alps for Venice, and you have to understand it because Venice is the most powerful, but it's also a bit bottled up geographically as far as what resources can be accessed or not. Genoa has to abandon, as we've seen, some of its most, let's say, remunerative ones because of the consolidation of Venetian power. But they also have sort of more variety. Also, as far as probably Western Europe proper, some greater access. And so Venice can make much more money, but has a greater difficulty in the sources choice, say, and especially when you think about metals, right? Also consider all the war that was going on, like how this is important for the ships, for the weapons of the crews, and so on. The Venetian commercial momentum in the 13th century was driven not only by her fleet, thus, but also by the German mining activities and the broader Central European metal trade. I recently made a video about 13th century Bohemia, Poland, and Hungary, by the way, with German Ostsiedlung mixed in the in between, and that can give you an idea of the fact where certain resources were extracted, how, especially in Bohemia, but not all, like at least among those three, Germany was a bigger market for that. And regarding the latter aspect, as suggested by a trading practice from 1315, it's important to note that significant flows, traffic flows, involve very specific, like, say, product groups. We can identify sort of 5 ones. So one is connected with the key commodities that were re-exported from various outflow points along the routes originating from the Indian Ocean. And this has to do mostly with spices, right? Spices were incredibly important for food preservation, for some luxury products in this sense, and lifestyle in general that was very much required. It would keep being like a steadily So even increasingly, like especially from the mid-14th century crisis, Europe, in a, say, at least ever more lucrative way, and Italian merchants in particular played, as we've seen, a significant role in re-exporting these spices throughout the Mediterranean and Europe themselves, meaning that they didn't just control the flow, but they literally moved across Europe, like with their goods by both sea and land. Albeit to a lesser extent, we find Provençals and Catalans participating in this trade, because, as we've seen, like there was already the Provençal and Catalan markets were first of all intertwined. The Crown of Aragon, as you know, was affirming itself, as we've seen, also at the expense of Genoa in the Western Mediterranean, and so Provençals also had some autonomy, also under the other powers' influence, including part of the same Italian republics, and the struggle between Pisa and Genoa, as we've seen, to say not to be like just a compact front, but in the sense to allow some gaps and the same margin of trade flowing. Another group is food products, right? Wheat purchased in the Ruthenian plains around the Black Sea, as well as in Apulia, Sicily, Sardinia province, and Andalusia, was exported to the rest of the Mediterranean as a whole. Right, the different republics access different markets, as we've seen. The Genoese were very much about the Black Sea, and they had an important infiltration in these other regions as well. Wines from the Kingdom of Naples were shipped to ports in the Levant, Africa, also Avignon, that in the early 14th century, as you know, will become the temporary see of the Papal Curia, and very much in between, at the border between the Holy Roman Empire and France, and also Bruges, Brugge. That was the most important Flemish market. Olive oil came from Apulia, the Marches in central Italy, Gaeta in the south, and Spain, reaching ports in the Levant and Africa as well. Walnuts, hazelnuts, and chestnuts from Naples were also shipped to others, to these places, as were cheeses from Apulia and Sicily, as well as salted meats from the same regions. Alright, southern Italy was very well put. Economically speaking, it was largely a feudal country, an agricultural one, but it was also urbanized to an extent that wouldn't see the level of political autonomy of the northern and central Italian communes, but that the local barons that controlled the hinterland had turned into massive, in fact, agricultural markets, providing with this, again, really abundant amount of products. Consider that southern Italy had also the second largest wool production after Spain, and so also this meat, for example, and cheese, like they were really very much produced. Now, sugar from Egypt, Cyprus, and Sicily was redistributed throughout the Mediterranean. Saffron from the Marches reached all the Levantine destinations. Finally, salt from Ibiza, Jerez, Sardinia, and other sources was intended to supply major cities. Right, so the Balearic Islands from essentially the Gibraltar Strait and Sardinia. So this places controlling important trade routes in the Western Mediterranean had probably a capacity of production of their own. If you consider Marches exporting saffron, the Levant, this is what, like even silk production, right? This is also what the West basically had taken from the East historically and started producing on their own in larger quantities that the same Levant could. Naturally, this had a lot to do with the disproportionately superior demographic and economical reality of Western Europe. Right, this is about the hinterlands. It's not about spices, like all these, say, goods coming from God knows where, and these people just being middlemen, shipping them to other places. They were literally produced locally, right? And this is what, of course, stemmed from the local production capabilities as well, which also shows how, not just how much Europe was already intertwined at the time from an economical point of view, but how much wealth was already available in order to specialize in this secondary products, right? Of course, like the majority of the local working force was absorbed in agricultural production, as food was consumed largely locally. You didn't need, unless there were particular famines, market crashes, and that were temporary in nature, to export like grain from some other places, right? But this could be a problem that mostly the more powerful, the richer, can afford to buy like from even far away places, right? This is incredibly important historically, because all these of those other markets, as we've seen, were dependent on these others, right? So if you let's say if you were running short of wheat, say, of bread for your people, and you depended on some faraway market, usually from a political point of view, at least this was an emergential situation of sort. It wasn't really like happening frequently, but say it was mostly like a commodity for mostly political reasons. It wasn't even just people starving to that. Exactly for this reason, that power was manifest in the possibility of politically banding these other places to ship grain preferentially to you, because you had more money, and in any case, if you had threatened to abandon those markets, you would have crushed those, and there was really no reason to do so as well. So it's actually an incredibly important aspect of this, like the international commercial connection, right? This is really, really crucial. So then you have raw materials as well that are that important. They were essential for the Italian textile production, for example. And for this, they were sourced primarily from outside Europe. Silk originated from Khotan, which was, interestingly enough, one of those city-states in the southern Tarim basin that we've seen in like Kuchan history and surroundings. This was the southernmost, like actually also one of the least historical, like one of the ones that had come latest, but they were this laid properly on one of the major Silk Route access to China, right? And they came from, let's say, they had local production there, and silk was then exported to the Caspian region. And as we've seen from there to the Silk Routes, they would be imported to Europe. Cotton did so from Syria and Turkey, while wool was imported from North Africa, specifically Barbary sheep was sort of the most obvious. All of those semi-nomads in the hinterland, right, having mostly in that their main source of, say, surplus of export goods. In addition, Italy relied on imports of alum and various dyeing substances, primarily derived from grain. This thriving trade was fueled by, of course, a growing demand for such materials, as the economy operators involved could capitalize on this trend. In Italy, furthermore, imported significant quantities of leather, skin, fur, and wax, particularly the Levantine wax, to support her textile manufacturing and craftsmanship that, as we know, were quite advanced. Italy was on the forefront technologically at this point, so these raw materials were so much needed for this. Essentially, proto-industrial activities. I think about arms and armor production, more like these are all things that you really need to make things work. In part, artifacts had the, like here, we're essentially going in order of importance from the, say, more systemically relevant, but also cheaper individually, to the, say, less systemically relevant, but sort of more luxury, right? So artifacts, of course, came next here, and among these we discover a variety of fabrics from the Levant, including the so-called ciambellotti and mezzanelli in Italian from Cyprus, the bucarami from Cyprus, Romania, and arsincan in Turkey, known as arzinga in Italian. We also find silk drapes originating from, say, Romania, Turkey, Baghdad, tabrets. So here we're, of course, following essentially the silk routes. And this silk drapes were redistributed not only within the same region, but also, of course, across Europe and North Africa. Additionally, European fabrics include linen clothes from Normandy, Champagne, Lombardy, and other areas, canvases from Burgundy and the Marches, linings from Provence, and woolen clothes from Flanders, France, Venice, Milan, Como, and Florence. And these fabrics were not only exported to the Levant, but also to North Africa. We see an overly abundant amount of resources in the first place, in part imported, in part produced, depending, of course, on what they were. But again, you understand why these policies effectively monopolized the market, and especially the trade flow between East and West. Finally, we find precious, but sometimes also non-precious metals that, as we've seen, were very much connected with the Venetian bubble of German origin. Again, the Germans found the best, buyers in just across the Alps, and these metals were, of course, also worked right by the Italians and exported. They had the most advanced arms and armor production, like in a way that, again, in terms of also business model, etc., was unmatched and by scale the most important ever. And that exported as far away as China, right? We often think, we've seen it in lots of videos about how Western weapons, especially to Central and Eastern Europe, were essentially purchased from Germany, from Italy, right? And we remained within that sphere, but metal artifacts were exported as far as China by the Italians, up to also, say, closer places that, however, are that sense that connected with these Italian exports. For example, the Tartar area was quite wide. We've seen how in Ruthenia, actually, Western weapons had always been there. Now there were Genoese colonies, literally in Crimea and at the mouth of the Don. Pontus, in fact, that was also, as you know, colonized by the Genoese, Romania, Lesser Armenia. We talked about Cilician warfare, for example. We've seen also how the Mamluk world, like Syria, Egypt, also Cyprus, does display a lot of Western influences, militarily speaking, in arms and armor. This is fundamentally the product of this exports. The silver produced in Genoa also reached as far as Damascus and Cairo, showing that, again, even if the Venetians were in between, fundamentally still, of course, the Genoese could export this stuff. Meanwhile, the so-called stamped copper from the Venetian bubble can be found in the same area. So you see a differentiation. The times that Genoese and Venetians were not at war, of course, they coexisted more or less peacefully on the markets, and they sort of specialize in different products. Iron from Venice was exported, for example, all over Romania, where the broader Byzantine area reached Cairo. Lead originating from the Levant, mostly Armenia, Cilicia and Armenia, is also traded in the same area, right? The Armenians were historic, also from the Caucasus, with which, of course, they maintained their connections with the other Armenians that had remained there, had been particularly famous for like metal working in relative abundance, and this was the case. We've seen it in the medieval warfare content at large. Sardinia was a significant producer of silver and lead. It had a quite interesting history because it had been colonized by the Pisans quite early on, 11th century. Like, it was properly a Pisan El Dorado or Silverado. I don't know whether in Spanish this word exists. Where the Pisans, as an expression of a, say, superior Western civilizational standards, basically occupied the coastlines, the ports, the markets, and mostly like keeping the native Sardinians at bay, the hinterland. The Sardinians were not really that underdeveloped, but of course, like, they couldn't hold very much the comparison with the Pisans, and were these important mineral resources in the hinterland that kept fueling, in fact, the same Pisan military fort. However, after Genoa defeated the Pisans at Meloria, there was a significant drop, like in the Pisan capacity holding Sardinia. It was just like a steady decline, but at a point at the Battle of Lucca Cisterna, the Aragonese defeat the Pisans and their German mercenaries and take over the island, that, however, is never fully controlled until quite very late in time, because the Genoese have in the meanwhile infested the northern part, and Sardinia is a terrible place. Like the hinterland is nightmarish. There is malaria. There are, it's really bad all over. Like the Aragonese a bit were, say, as a feudal country, of course, ideally, like, at least in this feudal dynastic sense, controlling these islands, but it was mostly the Catalans that had sort of more similar mindset to the Italians of just controlling the coastlands that really rule these places. And so the hinterland is always sort of a battleground. Now, the system of medieval trade was definitely shaped by products, with spices playing a dynamic role also due to their widespread redistribution. That was also relatively easy, given the amounts that, as you know, were like, you need like a few spices to use them, so you can export easily large amounts that can really make the difference, and are going to be paid highly. It's also the reason why the Italians introduced essentially the banknote in the history of economics at this point, because with all those branches that they have established all over Western Europe and beyond, they don't need to move actually precious metal. They just work with these papers that essentially begin that level of dynamicization of the market economy, finance, banking. And although the volume of trade was relatively limited, at least with no more than 1,000 tons of spices exchanged per year, other merchandise became integral components of these exchanges as well. And especially to meet the continuous demands of Italy's large cities that were really not just very big, but also very much concentrated, as we've seen, in a demographic sense, continentally wide, food products such as wheat and salt were imported into the markets of Genoa, Venice, and Florence, and so redistributed also elsewhere. Because again, they could be very big cities with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, and controlling part like what could be brought by merchants of other cities, and depending on the various commercial wars that happened, of course, also on land. All right. It could be quite serious also with papal interdicts that were effectively trade blockades at senility. These imports were crucial to satisfying the domestic demand, and they underpinned the entire Italian manufacturing sector, right, which relied in turn heavily on raw materials sourced from, as we've seen, outside Europe mostly. So it's an equilibristic game to an extent, but it can be played exactly because of the regressed amount of wealth, say, properly purchasing power that these communities have. And this trade assumed paramount importance for several centuries, as we've seen, like from the 11th and eventually to beyond. Like here, we don't venture into modern history, but consider that this is sort of a static thing overall by scale, right? We haven't, you see, there are so many strange ideas, cliches about medieval history. Do we want to acknowledge the hegemonic dominance of Western civilization and the economical monopoly of intercontinental trade by the Italians as a sort of default, right, of properly like European history? Is an incredibly important phase that lasts more than half of a millennium. So Italy and other Mediterranean countries reciprocated, as we've seen, by exporting their own products, including agricultural goods from southern Italy. That was a bit different, as we've seen. It was sort of more like yet another feudal European country, as opposed to, even though very agriculturally endowed and geographically closer to the central and the northern Italian communes. We've seen German silver, incredibly important, especially for Venice, copper, Flemish woolen cloth, French and Italian textiles, and linen fabrics. Right. So again, part of this demand was met internally, but there is external request as well. And trade between Mediterranean countries was really extensive. It was immense. I made a video about like the trade comparison in the second half of the 14th century between, I think, the Baltic and the Mediterranean was something like 1 to 13, 14. So just to give a dimension. And admittedly, well, yes, the Baltic trade, well, it had the Hanseatic League that really made a lot in interest of, say, merit, but it was nothing by scale. Even in the connection with the Ruthenian grain, etc., was happening in the Mediterranean. You have tens of thousands of tons being transported annually. And only the Italians have the maritime capacities to really make these cargoes sailing in the first place. Now, trade between the Mediterranean and Western Europe was primarily driven by the competition between spices and Flemish woolen cloth. That was the exchange mostly. It was the latter was so important. Eventually, as we said, the Italians started to copy that and produce the same type of cloth in their own city industries. They call also properly the Flemish to work for them, and they surpassed them in that. Spices were still were monopolized in trade by the Italians as middlemen, and in part they also produced them locally. So they were really well placed commercially on the market. It's true that Genoese ships, consisting of galleys and cogs, brought spices, alum, cotton, and dyeing substances to the North Sea directly. However, they returned with galleys laden with English wool, which they had acquired after starting from the 20s of the 14th century, and with empty hulls as well. So not all this balance was, of course, met equally, homogeneously, at least by these various actors, right? Also because we lack technical evidence, for example, as what quantities these ships could transport, for example. Like, it's not we have very detailed accounts of merchants at this point with an incredibly large amount of evidence, as a matter of fact. But it doesn't matter how much it is for the times and places, we cannot reconstruct through that the entire picture, right? Or essentially just even, I don't know, all these cargoes, for example, how they were connected to the single businesses, how the latter organized properly these expeditions, for example, in times of war, how they were able sort of to bail out of different situations, markets, because the market was that unstable, to tell the truth, and so also the strictly financial issues are more complicated than they really seem. I never made a video actually about banking in this period specifically, because banks proper at this point did not exist with the same level of safety and resources control. The system had just been going up without any sort of insight, like that there would have been a major crack. So later medieval banks are something better structured, and still it stems from these very Italian ones, but it took time before they arranged themselves in a different way. So much to discuss. Again, I'm sorry if I seem always so generic, but everything requires dedicated precision. This is a video just to introduce this specific topic of the differences between this republic and trade sort of policies, right? And so when we look at the essence of the Italian trade, we realize that this was mainly focused on the Mediterranean commerce. It's also kind of obvious. Whereas trade with the rest of Europe was characterized for Venice by exchanges involving spices, the rich products of the Mediterranean, and German silver. Right, that was in Italy the single most sort of continental European connected market. Lombardy, for example, had great industries, and she mostly exported rather than else. She had more ties with Genoa for external imports than anything. So Genoa and the Tuscan cities in general, Genoa is not a Tuscan city, but I mean that sort of Ligurian Tyrrhenian trade entailed exchange between spices, say silk, fabrics from Lucca, for example, because there were these major textile centers, all the central northern Italian and Flemish cities. These are the most urbanized places in Europe, fundamentally specializing to textile production, right? And so they would end up connecting, as we've seen, these markets. That was already true from the time of the Champagne fairs, but it intensifies even when the French markets and trade routes enter a crisis. And so there is exchange of woolen and linen clothes from northern to southern Europe and vice versa. And due to the fact that these trades were primarily conducted over land routes, they were inherently limited in scale compared to the potential at least offered in some circumstances by, say, naval maritime routes. Right? I think the case of Genoa is really remarkable because it shows you how it wasn't much about blocking trades between competitors. It was rather about sort of limiting them to an extent. And so it was all a policy dictated by this overall income rather than the impossibility of still reaching a place or another. As we've seen, Venice had more difficulties to reach Flanders from the Gibraltar Strait or the Atlantic route than Genoa, but still they do it, because after all, how do you really block them, right? There's not really like a possibility of blockading a strait per se. But of course the Genoese in that route are more dominant. Equally, the Genoese have to literally open that Atlantic route that they wouldn't otherwise use, because the Venetians and the Catalans had coalesced against her. But she still has that Romanian Aegean hub. The Genoese still find themselves in the Levant, and they keep remaining where they had been for centuries, in North Africa, Sudan, etc. So it's really that far-ranged, and with multiple options. Pisa declines, but they had been doing pretty similar things after all. And so even at that point, it's just Genoa getting the upper hand rather than anything else in particular, right? And so I think that these aspects are really, really crucial to understand so much of that necessity, so much of how even eventually those political and strategical thinking was dictated. Because if you did most of this at sea and somebody had the capacity to navally threaten you, like these rivals would, well, what could you do about that, right? If not going at sea and spending that enormous amount of money. As I was saying in the beginning, there was a reason if naval warfare absorbed those utterly insane resources. Until you contextualize them in this, and the kind of wealth that stem from these traffics, well, there's so much. And the interesting aspect is also the limit actually naval control. I mean, there were all these powers to balance each other out at sea, and so yes, they could have so many resources, but they also didn't have exactly the ones needed to control the entirety of Mediterranean to knock these rivals out. And this is the same a bit for many other, for example, continental Italian powers that fight for centuries before being able to subjugate this city or another. And actually Genoa and Venice, that for geographical reasons are sort of isolated from the mainland, they have in fact also this easier niche, right, from which that allows them not to involve themselves into land issues, not to be threatened fundamentally. At some point, I think that we will also start to make content about the single connections with places. We've seen as far as Khotan, for example. We haven't talked too much about India today, but I mean, there is really a lot going on internationally, intercontinentally, that especially at this point, 13th century, the early 14th, is sort of criminally underrated also a bit. The idea that peoples in the world didn't know about each other, had to wait colonization. People fixate the so-called age of colonization, fixate so much about specific tropes for, say, mostly self-referential, almost narcissistic, pseudo-historical reasons, and they don't get to the actual basis, hey, at least in order of importance, what should be, in fact, understood in this regard, and we hardly see it. We hardly, can appreciate it to the degree it deserves. It's always sort of difficult to, of course, to present these topics in a relevant way, but there is an effort that one must do, probably from an individual standpoint to say, okay, how interested am I actually about this whole enterprise? Like how much do I think that this reality sort of applies to, say, sort of defines the world in which I also live now? Because not caring about this seems incredibly, really incomprehensible, right? And unfortunately, the knowledge of the Middle Ages in the average awareness is extremely poor. It stops to cliches. It doesn't seem to get anywhere in particular. Yet this is what we know, right? In proportion, and so it's really strange how we tend to not to hide it, because that's not the point, but to properly act as if we didn't need to get into the essentials of it. Right? We will have to talk a lot about this. As you know, I'm not the greatest fan of the history of economics in general, because I think that it's overrated, at least in that technical. Okay, let's talk just about that without considering the main implications in the other fields. I am a Clausewitzian who knows, let's say, how to at least frame the major issues into, like, I study military history, but of course it doesn't make any sense if I don't relate it to the Clausewitzian Trinity. And the point is that when you read history of economics studies, most of the times it's just finding, again, the price of that damned cow, right, as a matter of personal accomplishment. And actually, I don't see how interesting that can actually be, at least if you're not connecting, in fact, to the especially to the political, the dimensional history, which is exactly what economists, let's say, at least the students of economic history, tend not to want to research, because they think, oh my god, I have to square the circle here, without considering that there is a non-deterministic factor in this all, and that if you want to make a picture of how things were going, certain aspects can seem steady flows even when they decrease, but they are actually subjected to a multitude of factors that if you don't consider politically, primarily so, like the question is, where do you go with it, right? How can you even start reasoning also about economics? That's a problem, and that, in my opinion, like, of course there are scholars that understand this very well, but the general footprint is still this, well, okay, other aspects are not so important. I don't even know how one could feel history of economics as a topic of election, almost. Like, how can they simply snub other branches, other disciplines that are just like the military one, just by itself more important? That's the self-centered, sort of self-absorbed attitude that I don't like at all. Again, we have so many topics connected with these videos. I use normally the fixed comment at the top of the section to list all the various connections, because YouTube does not do it, doesn't let you know how much I've done, and that you can't quite understand my content if you haven't watched the rest. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.